Okay, so to begin with this, I want to just do a quick kind of revision with you. I mean, now that you're at the end of the unit, you should hopefully know the answer to these questions, but I just want to get a feel for where you're at, and I will add some insights that you can note down as well as we go through it. So question one is, what type of narration is used in the novel and why? Great, so it's a first-person narrator, first-person narration, and it's unreliable. Why is it important that you have an unreliable narrator? Right, so we've got Ono as the narrator, the protagonist. Very good. So it's unreliable, so that means that we have to be aware that it's very biased, isn't it? Right? It's subjective. So it speaks to the subjectivity of truth and the way that people are able to actually reconstruct narratives, right? So Ono's trying to reconstruct, in various times throughout the novel, he's trying to reconstruct the past in a way, isn't he? He's trying to give a more favorable perspective to himself because he feels a bit guilty, he's in denial, because he contributed to the propaganda which fed into this nationalistic spirit of Japan, which led up to World War II and their involvement. And obviously they then kind of lost the war and thousands of people died. So his generation is being blamed for that, so that when he's telling the story after the war, we need to be aware that it's coming from his perspective, so he can actually kind of manipulate facts and he can manipulate things so that we're not sure of what actually happened. An important note on that with the unreliable first-person narrator is that that's a feature of postmodernism, if you like, okay? There are a few different postmodern elements, and I won't go too much into that term, but it's important to know that postmodernism is all about challenging conventional truths and values, right? And what's something that's conventional in a novel, for instance, is a linear plot line. But do we have a linear narrative structure here? No, it's non-linear and it kind of goes all over the place, and that's a kind of experimental form. So that's another example of postmodernism, because postmodernism kind of goes against what people expect, what the tradition is, okay? The unreliability also plays into postmodernism, okay, as a concept, because it basically exposes the subjectivity of truth. And it suggests that there is no one truth or one perspective, but that everyone has their own perspective. Okay, so that unreliability plays into that as well. Okay, so there's non-linearity to it. It kind of bounces around. What are those little episodes called? Could call them episodes, but what else can you call them? Vignettes. That's a really important term. Okay, so when you're talking about the structure, a word I would also use is fragmented. It's a fragmented structure because it's following the inner movements of Ono's mind, isn't it? So when it's bouncing around, it's like we're inside Ono's head a little bit. But you've got a fragmented structure. It's non-linear, so it doesn't just go in chronological order. And another word I heard as well, which was really good there, is it's digressive, right? There are digressions. He's constantly going on tangents. It's tangential. When you're talking about form, you don't want to just say non-linear structure, non-linear structure. You need to use these other terms like fragmented, vignettes. It's almost like a stream of consciousness structure as well. The style itself, when you actually look at each line, I wouldn't say that that's stream of consciousness right in. There's a lot of dialogue, but in terms of how the formality of it is quite refined and formal, so therefore you wouldn't think he's just thinking these things up as, it's not like it's just projecting his thoughts as he thinks them, but from a structural point of view, it is that. It is going from thought to thought, memory to memory. Okay, so there's kind of a stream of consciousness structure, if you like, there. Where is the novel set? Japan, post-World War II, but then also there are various elements from pre-World War II, right, in Japan. Now, why is it bouncing around from pre-World War II, post-World War II? What's happened in that time? This is like the critical point as well for anyone's argument. If you're trying to develop a thesis here, I think this is like the underlying thing. Why are we going from before World War II to after World War II? He's stuck in the past, very good. And his struggle, excellent. So his struggle is to adapt to the present. There's been a cultural shift, you see? So there's a moment of, Japan is in a moment of transition, but Ono's identity and his values and his worldview, they're all anchored to the past. Okay, so make sure you've got that note. His self-worth, right, reputation, it's all anchored to the past. And yet the present context in which he's living in demands him to adapt, right? He has to actually change his values, but it also requires him to accept moral responsibility. That's the tension for him. He has to accept moral responsibility and accept that everything he stood for before the war, to some extent, was actually not as moral as he thought, right? He thought he might have been doing the right thing in spreading, this nationalistic sentiment, being very patriotic about his country, but then we saw the destruction that came from that. So now he's actually seeing a broader perspective that says everything you stood for is actually not as great as you thought. And it's very hard to come to terms with that, isn't it? He's lived his whole life dedicated to a cause Everything he stood for has proven to be what? Destructive, damaging, right? It had catastrophic ramifications for the country, right? And he's now finished up with his career. So we're looking at him in denial and him trying to accept some moral responsibility there.